and generate some revenue. We have been working really closely with our bankers,
migrations in the
and
20th
our
century.
investors,
His
and
books have
often
received
we
several
talk
awards.
regularly
Professor
to
Stola
ensure
has
that there's a
lectured in
clear
history and
understanding of
served on
what the
advisory boards
realities
of
on the
several
ground,
Polish and
how what our
international
approach
institutions
is,
and journals.
and how,
For his contribution to research
how
on
we
Poland's
are
history,
managing
he
some of
was
these
awarded
issues.
the Knight's Cross of the Order
We have
of
incorporated,
Polonia Restituta. Since
indigenous
2014,
issues
he has
into
been
our
the director of the
investment review
Polin Museum of the
process
History of
internally,
Polish
so
Jews
that,
in Warsaw, a
before
widely
we
acclaimed
invest in a
institution which
project
has
or
won
we
leading
invest
European museum awards
in
and
buying
attracts half a
buying an
million
asset,
visitors annually.
we have a due
Dariusz.
diligence process that takes
Thank you
into
very much.
account
It's
what are the
my great pleasure
implications
to
on an
speak today
indigenous,
here. It's my second visit to the center. Last time I had the pleasure of talking on a topic of history. I'm a historian, but today I will speak about a very recent history, about the history of this year. Until January this year, Poland was often presented not only as a model of post-communist economic and political transformation, but also as a success story in coming to terms with the difficult past, with the Holocaust. And it suddenly ended with a heated controversy around the legislation, which passed through the Polish parliament in late January, early February this year. I would like to put this legislation and the debate that followed, the controversy that followed, within a longer perspective of at least a dozen of Polish debates on the Holocaust that took place in the last 30 years, but have roots going much longer to the time of the Holocaust itself. So first, let me quote the controversial fragment of this legislation, which formally was an amendment to the Act on the Institute of National Remembrance, an institution created initially to deal with the archives of the Communist Security Service, and then expanded its role into research, education, and covers now a longer history, not just the communist period, but a longer history. So to this act, the bill proposed to introduce an article which read, "Whoever publicly and contrary to the facts attributes responsibility or co-responsibility to the Polish nation or the Polish state for Nazi crimes committed by the Third Reich, or for other felonies that constitute crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, or war crimes, or whoever otherwise grossly diminishes the responsibility of the true perpetrators, shall be liable to a fine or imprisonment up to 3 years." So quite serious threat of up to 3 years in prison for some claims. And the proponents of this bill, justified by relatively numerous incidents of statements that were not only factually untrue, but also very disturbing for many Poles, such as Polish death camps or Polish concentration camps. And while for English speakers, a term like a Polish death camp may sound like a geographic description of where the camp was located. The translation in Polish actually means that the camp was established or run by the Poles. So it's, of course, there is an ambiguity in the English term, but the translation somehow leaves no doubts about who was the responsible agent for these camps. And such statements for at least several years became the topic of scrutiny, of interest of media and politicians. And for at least a few years, Polish diplomats in various countries were registering instances of such statements, intervening with editors of newspapers or TV channels, demanding corrections or explanations, usually successfully. And we know that annually there were between 100 or 200 such instances globally. For a world of 7 billion people is not too many, but still even a single instance of this kind was highly disturbing. In Poland, as it implied, at least in the Polish translation, that Poland or Poles had something to do with establishing or running the death camps. The opponents of this legislation, including myself, claimed that first it's the battle against English grammar. Second, that yes, at times such statement resulted from a combination of ignorance and anti-Polish prejudice, and I have met a couple of people who believe that yes, Poles were involved in establishing death camps. But if so, this is not a problem that should be given to the public prosecutor, but rather to educators, that the proper answer to ignorance is education. In fact, I wrote my first article about similar idea of a similar legislation already 10 years ago. There are at least 15 years of history of such attempts to introduce into Polish legal code some restrictions on speech that pertain to this topic. One was relatively effective about a decade ago, but it was then struck down by the Constitutional Tribunal on legal technicality then. And it came back. It was about 2 years ago when the Ministry of Justice, Polish Ministry of Justice, submitted this bill to the parliament, although it remained in the committees and subcommittees for almost 2 years. And then in late January, it took us by surprise, I mean, us, those who opposed this idea. And some colleagues, especially colleagues from the Polish Center for Holocaust Research, did protest right at the beginning, but then somehow it disappeared, and everybody thought it would remain dead in the committees, as happens with many bills. Hence, even greater was the surprise when it was legislated at a highly unusual speed. The Senate actually approved it on a midnight session, which doesn't happen very often in Poland. And then the President Duda, hesitated a few days, but he was under heavy pressure, especially from right-wing media. There was a demonstration of radical nationalists in front of his office who were so demanding that he should not bow to the Jews. And they were chanting, "Take down Yarmulka," and signed the bill. And eventually, he did sign the bill, but he sent it for constitutional review to the Constitutional Tribunal, assuming that it is controversial, should be reviewed. And then controversy erupted. And what is interesting is the story of the reactions to the bill and the reactions to the reactions. Israeli ambassador reacted very quickly, and it was actually the Remembrance Day for the victims of the Holocaust, when Ambassador Azari made a very strong statement about it. And then other Israeli politicians, including the Prime Minister, made surprisingly strong statements, or surprisingly for very good Polish-Israeli relations in the past 25 years about it. Also, the government of this country made a critical statement of the Secretary of State on this legislation. So that was international reaction to this document. There was a reaction to the document also at home. So the Polish Historical Association was very critical about it. Polish Society for Jewish Studies, Polish Association for Yiddish Studies, the academic board of the History Department of Warsaw University. We at Polin Museum, we have also issued a statement critical of this legislation, following the lines we've just mentioned. Although much more vocal were the reactions to the reactions. That means the very critical reaction, especially by Israeli politicians, led to a wave of publications, especially by right-wing media and various voices online. And you cannot overestimate the role of the social media in this debate. That was probably the first Polish debate on the Holocaust that was largely happening in a social media. I think you cannot understand it without the role of Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube. And especially the media of the right and the far right were very eager to quote statements that were not only critical about this legislation, but were critical about the Poles in general, claiming that Poles are and have been anti-Semites and will remain anti-Semites probably forever. So in this sense, there was an escalating tendency to exchange recriminations between Poland and abroad. And it did look bad, I mean, from a historian perspective, after a while, and no one was asking historians about what actually did happen during the war. Were there any Poles involved in doing anything wrong towards the Jews? So our opinions didn't matter. Some of the media even claimed that this is a matter of national honor, and we should not give a single inch in this discussion. So it was quite a surprise when 6 months later, in even a faster legislation, which took 1 day, the government submitted a bill in the morning and the president signed it in the evening, removing the most controversial fragment from this legislation. And then there was a joint declaration by the prime ministers of Poland and Israel, which to some extent explained it and promised some cooperation and dialogue about history. So that was the short history of this legislation. I must state that a part of it remains. There is another paragraph which still allows non-governmental organizations to sue such incidents, but in the civil process. And also there is a paragraph about the denial of crimes committed by Ukrainian nationalists. I would say even more controversial when you have a close look on it, and I'm very surprised it remains on the books. So this is the short story of this legislation, but I would like to put it in a longer perspective. Because while watching the controversy expand, I realized that someone understood it already 75 years ago. And this man was a Polish poet. His name was Czesław Miłosz. He spent most of his life living in exile in this country. He was teaching at Berkeley, California. And in 1943, Czesław Miłosz wrote a poem. In 1943, he was in Warsaw, watching Warsaw Ghetto in flames. And he wrote a poem which he was published illegally underground under the title, A Poor Christian Looks at the Ghetto. And I would like to read the last fragments of it. It's about the destruction and death, basically. And then the poet introduced a figure of a mole, an animal digging through the ruins of a destroyed city and discovering bodies and ashes. And the mole has the features of a patriarch. So the poet says, I'm afraid of the guardian mole. What will I tell him? I, a Jew of the New Testament, waiting 2,000 years for the second coming of Jesus. My broken body will deliver me to his side, and he will count me among the helpers of death, the uncircumcised. So Miłosz expressed the fear of being counted among the helpers of death, just by the fact of being uncircumcised in Warsaw in 1943. This poem was the beginning of a debate in Poland about Polish, non-Jewish Polish reactions to the Holocaust in 1987, the first big Polish debate on reactions to the Holocaust, which began with a publication by Professor Jan Błoński, a highly respected literary scholar, in a Catholic weekly. Some people call it the only independent weekly between Berlin and China at that time. It was censored, but it wasn't controlled by the Communist Party. And this Błoński began this article with the quotation of this article. And it was largely, he called for a moral, symbolic compensation for passivity or indifference in face of the Jewish tragedy during the Holocaust. And it stirred a major controversy. You know, Poland 1987, the communist regime was already eroding, imploding, and it allowed for much more open discussion than it had been possible just a few years before. But it was interesting, the title of the article was Poor Poles Look at the Ghetto. So what Błoński did, he translated a problem which Miłosz defined as an individual, metaphysical problem on non-Jews, of a non-Jew, a Christian, into a national problem and collective one. Not a poor Christian, a single Christian, but poor Poles, collective we of the Poles. And that set the direction of a series of Polish debates on the Holocaust that unfolded in the 1990s and early 2000s. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, just let me list them. So soon afterwards, after the Błoński debate of 1987, we had a major debate about the Carmel Monastery in Oświęcim, Auschwitz. You may remember, in the 1980s, again, parallelly to the gradual erosion of the communist government, it allowed Catholic nuns to move into a building right outside of the barbed wire of Auschwitz I, in a former camp building, which some of Jewish organizations vocally protested against. And then the controversy lasted a few years. It took Pope John II personally to move the nuns to another place. That was not about the Polish reactions to the Holocaust. Probably that was the second group of the Polish debates on the Holocaust, which was largely about who's Auschwitz, who is the owner of Auschwitz, symbolically today. Because Poles, the Polish nation, Polish government, local government, Poles in general, are custodians of several memorial sites, of which Auschwitz, the largest concentration and death camp in Europe, is best known. In 1994, we had another controversy. That was the year of the anniversary of the Warsaw Rising of 1944, the 50th anniversary. And it was the first time the round anniversary was celebrated in democratic Poland, because the communists, through many years, they were distorting the history, if not slandering the history of the uprising. And then the controversy started with a short article, actually a review in Gazeta Wyborcza, the major newspaper of Poland at that time, about a book which mentioned a killing of several Jews during the uprising by the Polish fighters, rogue soldiers of one of the organizations fighting in the uprising. And again, it started a major controversy about how Poles reacted to the fate of the Jews during the war. Then we had in the late 1990s actually a series of debates, again about Auschwitz. One was about who should speak first, Elie Wiesel or Lech Wałęsa, at the commemoration of the liberation of the camp. And then we had a controversy around a goodwill act of a group of Polish Boy Scouts who planted several religious symbols, Christian, Jewish, next to the Birkenau camp, very close to the site of the gas chambers, which was understood as an attempt to Christianize the place. And again, we had the problems with the cross. Next to the building which the nuns, the Carmelite nuns, left following the Pope's order, there remained a cross. They left a cross. And the rumors spread in the late 1990s that Jewish organizations demand to remove it. And a group of self-proclaimed defenders of the cross called to stand and defend it and plant new crosses. Altogether, they planted, as far as I remember, 264 crosses in the yard next to the Auschwitz I camp. It seemed almost completely, it seemed impossible to resolve. Finally, it was. The crosses were removed, the single cross remained, and I was telling Isabella before our meeting that for me is an example that sometimes what is philosophically impossible practically is. The cross remained, but not to, well, the solution for the controversy about how to commemorate the victims of Auschwitz. And in addition to about 1 million of Jewish victims, there is more than at least 100,000 of non-Jewish, mostly Christian victims of the camp. The solution for this problem was simpler than anyone could imagine. Someone planted the trees around the cross, so you cannot see it from the camp. The cross remains, but it's not visible. It is no longer an object of controversy. So I quote it as a beautiful, practical solution to an philosophically impossible problem. But the biggest Polish debate on the Holocaust was only to come at that time. This biggest debate followed the publication of a book by another exilee from Poland, Professor Jan Tomasz Gross, who left Poland after the 1968 anti-Zionist campaign. He published a small book about a mass killing committed in a small town of Jedwabne in the summer of 1941. Jedwabne had been in the Soviet zone of occupation of Poland between 1939 to 1941. And then in few weeks after the German invasion in the summer of 1941, the Jewish inhabitants of the town were killed in a mass crime by their Polish neighbors, hence the title of the book, Neighbors. And this book started the major controversy on history in Poland ever. I have seen many controversies on the communist regime, on the various politicians involved in communist secret service, but I have never seen anything as intensive and as widespread as the debate that followed the publication of this book. Participants involved from the President of Poland, Mr. Kwaśniewski, bishops, philosophers, most of historians who have done anything on this topic, down to ordinary people who are expressing these voices. While there were some nasty voices in this debate, in general, I remember it as one of the major achievements of Polish democracy, because it turned out that we have developed a language to speak about the most difficult topic, and a participation in a mass killing of men, women, and children, burning them in a barn. I cannot imagine a more difficult topic. When you compare it to the Błoński debate, 1987, Błoński talk about passivity or indifference. But one of his sentences was that God took our hand from participating in killing. As we learned 13 years later, in some places it didn't happen. Actually, yes, some Poles did participate in the killing of Jews. And one of the consequences of this debate was a formal investigation by a public prosecutor, reopening of the case, because some of the perpetrators of the crime were already imprisoned after the war in communist Poland. Reopening of the case, when very in-depth investigation, and the final report stated that yes, the perpetrators sensu stricto were local Poles, although a guiding role was played by a group of German officers who arrived to this town. So yes, there were Germans, probably inspiration came from them, they organized it, by the direct participation, unquestionably, there was at least a few dozen Poles who participated. And then a proper monument was erected in the town of Jedwabne, although the inhabitants of Jedwabne largely rejected this interpretation. Because some of the people proposed another, that there was a large group of Germans who with firearms either terrorized Poles into collaboration or themselves killed the Jews, but historical research did not confirm this claim. Later on, Professor Gross published 2 additional books on similar topics. Fear, in 2008, it was a book about the Kielce pogrom of 1946, the largest pogrom in post-war Europe, when 42 people were killed in the summer of 1946. And Golden Harvest in 2011. So on a similar topic, it was about digging in the mass graves in search of gold near the death camp of Treblinka. So as you can imagine, very grim topics, highly controversial, widespread controversy, but not as intensive, not as wide, not as consequential as the Jedwabne debate. So in this long series, I need to mention 2 more minor controversies in the late 1990s about establishment of a supermarket near the Auschwitz camp and about a dancing club in the town of Oświęcim. Oświęcim is a Polish name for Auschwitz. And basically it was about, should the teenagers of Oświęcim dance or not? Do they allow them to dance? And some people, especially people who live far away from Oświęcim and who are much older than 19, claim that no, they shouldn't. I must say that this proposed club was quite far away from the camp, but there was a controversy, and again that was controversy, what are the limits of proper commemoration? What are the obligations resulting from the fact that Poland was the place of horrible deaths of millions of Polish and European Jews and other victims of the German terror machine? To my knowledge, no other country in post-communist Europe had such large debates. There were incidents practically in every European country, maybe except 2, Russia and Belarus. There were such debates about reactions to the Holocaust. Otherwise, almost everywhere you had them. What was striking for me when I read about these debates later on, and you had debates in Switzerland, Sweden, France, Germany, Italy recently, there was a book of Italian perpetrators too, is that somehow it was of secondary importance if the given country was a German ally during the war or actually was fighting against Germany, which is quite surprising when you think about it, because during the war that was the most important dimension. Are you for or against Nazi Germany in this war? But because this debate focused on reactions to the Holocaust, reactions to the genocide committed on Jews in many various countries when they were deported, somehow this military aspect was secondary. In Poland, this debate also involved the question of the position of the Polish government in exile. We had a government in exile in London at that time. There was a Polish underground army loyal to this government in exile and some other underground military organizations. So thanks to the controversies, we have seen a dramatic progress in the research on these topics. We have, on almost every aspect of it, we have now a new research. It's not, I cannot say everything has been done. Still, there are many blank spots about the sociology of the German occupation, how Germans actually ruled, especially Polish countryside. But the progress was was substantial. The most recent controversy, this year controversy, was strikingly different to all previous ones. It didn't begin with any statement by historians or scholars in general. Its tendency was the opposite. It's not all the previous debates were expanding the field of possible topics for conversation and civilized disagreement. This one was to restrict it. It was to penalize on certain untrue statements on the past. However, what is true and what is untrue was left to the public prosecutor. One of the teachers who cooperate with our museum, we have a network of teachers all around Poland, called me a week after this legislation, and he said, well, in addition to teaching about the Holocaust in my class, I also publish in a local county bulletin. And I have just published fragments of an account of a Holocaust survivor from our town. And in this account, post-war account, the author wrote, Poles killed my brother. Do the new legislation apply to me? Okay. I quoted you the exact wording of this legislation, and it was about falsely attributing responsibility to the Polish nation or the Polish state. Well, who is the Polish state? We know is the president, prime minister, ministers, maybe some officials of the government, but it's not clear who is the Polish nation. How many polls it take to make sure the statement is about the Polish nation? And that was one of the reasons why historians objected to it, because it left too much power to the public prosecutor. And it inevitably would have led, and it has already led, to a chilling effect. You know, think from the perspective of this teacher in a small county town in provincial Poland, that he has a perspective of being called to the public prosecutor to explain what did he mean when publishing a sentence, Poles killed my brother. Probably he would have been left, not sentenced, but still the sheer fact that his schoolmaster learns that one of the teachers is called to the public prosecutor for slandering the Polish nation wouldn't help him. So this debate was different. As I said, the reactions to the reactions were especially worrisome. We have seen a wave of anti-Jewish hate speech online at that time, including against our museum. So we were watching it very closely. Although in the middle of the controversy, it happened that colleagues from the Polish Center for Holocaust Research were releasing the most recent book. It's a report of a few years long research project on attempts to hide in 9 rural Polish counties. So the least known aspects of the Holocaust. A very grim lecture, as much say, but we have never seen so many people, and we have organized a meeting, a discussion with the authors at our museum. We have never seen so many people coming. There was a long queue waiting in front of the museum. They sold all the copies on a single evening, including my copy. Then on April 19, we have our annual campaign to commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the Daffodil Campaign. Our volunteers distribute yellow daffodils as a sign of memory, very much like the British and Canadians remember the fallen in the First World War. So this year we had twice as many volunteers. 2,000 of our volunteers distributed 150,000 paper daffodils in a single day in Warsaw. So this controversy, contrary to the previous controversies, I don't see it brought us an intellectual progress, but it did polarize. We have seen the polarizing tendency in the Polish society among those who saw it as a defense of the honor of Polish nation, which should allow public prosecutor to ask historian why, what did he think, publishing certain statements, and those who believe that nothing helps us better than the truth. I understand that you may have specific interest in this long and complex story. I really abbreviated it. There is a lot of secondary literature on the Polish debates in the Holocaust, at least 4 books that deal with this debate, so you can consult them. But if you have any questions, I will be ready to answer. Thank you for your attention.
Dariusz, thank you very much. I'm sure we have a lot of questions, and while people are gathering their thoughts, I want to ask you, You know, we seem to be living, and you alluded to it, we seem to be living at a time when people like to sort of grasp find a narrative that works for them, and they hold on to it. It resonates with them, and they don't seem to care so much about the facts underpinning this narrative. And a lot of times they will accuse the other side of not knowing the facts or misusing the facts. It almost feels as if we're sort of creating our own history bubbles that we prefer to dwell in. So how do you, I don't know, what is your take on this, and how do we counteract it?
Well, when you use the term bubble, it's about new media where the discussion takes place. As I said, that was the first Polish debate on the Holocaust that was taking place mostly online. And why the Błoński debate was a debate in the print media, why the Crosses and Auschwitz debate was the debate in television. It was exchange of images. Today you have parallel streams of narratives that sometimes simply don't meet, and people don't know opinions of others. Second, I think a part of this major change in communication, which is connected to the technological revolution, is that the sheer idea of the truth has been challenged. The expertise, the idea that when you are not sure about something, you should ask an expert, has been challenged. And in practically in all these debates, there was a moment in the controversy when participants, including politicians, were calling historians for help. You know, in a sense, it was a way of depoliticizing some of these debates when they were excessively hot. So politicians were calling historians, you should please discuss it, find out how it really happened, and then tell us. So we were telling them, sometimes we disagreed, there were legitimate controversies among historians. That is, of course, possible when you have fragmentary evidence, and we have fragmentary evidence on for many specific questions. But the principle that the best way of solving a public discussion on history is to ask historians was not put under question. And a novelty today is that historians are presented as a special interest group. Okay? That our job is not seeking truth, that our job is getting money from someone for a research grant. And I think this is really serious. I saw it as a part of something wider, a tendency to emancipate human beings from the impersonal tyranny of the truth. The communists wanted to liberate humankind from the impersonal tyranny of capitalism, of the market. It didn't went very well. But now, when you see the stream of fake news, intentional or unintentional, some people sell fake news because it brings them profits. Some accept it because this is the truth that suits them most of many interpretations they received. But the problems that we were facing this year were expression of something much wider, I would say global, about our capacity of collectively reaching an agreement of what did happen in the past.
Thank you very much. So why don't we, let's see, there's a question over there. Please wait for the mic. Please state, right here. Please state your name and affiliation, and because we have so many people here, please be brief with your question.
Thank you. My name is Stephen Stoltenberg. I work at the State Department. You mentioned that the most objectionable provisions of the law have been withdrawn, but you also mentioned that civil penalties remain, as do questions regarding the interpretation of the law. I recall that when the law's first version appeared, there were guidelines on the Justice Ministry's website as to how to interpret, for example, the question you raised. What is the Polish nation, and how many Poles does it take to constitute the Polish nation? And the Justice Ministry argued that there were two precedents in Polish jurisprudence for interpreting it very broadly. If you used Poles in the plural, you were referring to the Polish nation. And the Justice Ministry was the ministry that drafted the law. So my question to you is, what is the danger now for the government, because the courts are coming increasingly under the government's control, what is the danger now for the government to use this law to bring civil penalties against people such as yourself or your museum?
Well, I'm not an expert, and I'm not a lawyer, so I must rely on opinions on others. So what I heard is that we don't have proper precedents for the application of these clauses. This is one. So we are looking forward. What kind of positions the courts may take. And of course, you're right. It depends on independence of the judiciary. Because what you said was the opinions of some bureaucrats at the Ministry of Justice, and the courts may be of different opinion as they are in many very essential aspects in Poland today. So we have to wait and see what will happen in the future. From what I have learned from my colleagues' lawyers, it's rather unlikely the interpretation that this quotation from the memoir of a survivor that the teacher asked me to interpret would be treated as a slander of the good memory of the Polish nation. But we have to wait and see.
Okay. Right here, please.
My name is John Trop, Polish American Congress, Director of Policy Planning National Office. And my question goes to why this year's IPN law may have been different from the debate previous years. You mentioned that moral responsibility was at issue from 1987 to the present. But this year, the debate on the new IPM law came at the same time that the United States Senate was debating the JUST Act of 2017, also known as Senate Resolution 447, which called on the United States government to make sure that all the countries that signed the Terezin Declaration of 2009 paid the money they promised to pay. And in Poland's case, the bill was up to $365 billion, the highest figure cited. Do you think that the shift from financial responsibility to moral responsibility may play a role in this year's very animated, very bitter debate?
Well, I have heard conspiracy theories that connect these two legislations here in the United States, the motion of your Congress and the Polish legislation, but I've never have seen any solid arguments to connect them. It seems like a coincidence, and if not, it was the Polish lawmakers who decided to open this question, not the Americans. If it was more than a coincidence, it was by the decision of the Polish parliament rather than American Congress at that time. But it seems to me, I'm not an expert in American policy, and especially in it. However, I've read a kind of conspiracy theories connecting it in the Polish debate in the spring this year. And I would rather put it under something which the experts in research on ethnic prejudice called secondary anti-Semitism. And the secondary anti-Semitism is a claim that the Jews deliberately want us to feel guilty for the Holocaust, to extract material and political profits out of it. And this is probably the most dynamic, the most fast-spreading prejudice or opinion that is fueling anti-Jewish emotions in Europe at that time. So I haven't seen any evidence that could confirm the connection that you have mentioned.
Thank you. Right there.
Tom Timberg, no affiliation. It seems to me that a lot of what you're describing is, if you will, various Polish intellectual traditions, ideological trends, settling things among themselves, and this issue is just one that they find convenient. I'm particularly struck because, of course, Czesław Miłosz, on the one hand, is probably one of the most famous Polish intellectuals of the 20th century, but he is also, for the same kind of people, a very controversial figure. Mm-hmm. They're very hostile to him, not because of that particular poem, but mm-hmm. because of his general humanist, culturally tolerant position. I mean, I mm-hmm. read a very interesting correspondence between him and the famous Yiddish writer Chaim Grada, who was a friend of his from their more or less student days in Vilna.
I understand this is a comment. I would rather put it this way. It's remarkable how leading Polish minds engaged into efforts to find proper answers to the questions that the experience of the Second World War posed. And someone else, a British historian once said that the challenge for the 20th century philosophy is to find the answers to the 20th century history. And it seems that Miłosz has done his job in it. He contributed, and he was an eyewitness. And interestingly, you have other leading Polish writers, Naukowska, Tadeusz Borowski. You know, some of the most powerful verses on the Second World War came from the Polish writers. So in a sense, it's a privilege. It's a privilege and maybe also a mission for intellectuals of Eastern Europe, intellectuals of the countries which Tim Snyder located in the Bloodlands, where almost everyone was eyewitness to horrible scenes. So more fortunate nations like France or this country, where only those citizens who were sent to war could have seen comparable horrors, if they've seen any. While in Eastern Europe, it was a massive experience of many people to so unspeakable scenes. And maybe this experience can tell us something about humanity. You know, this is why I mentioned that Błoński's decision to translate A Poor Christian Looks at the Ghetto into Poor Poles Look at the Ghetto. It didn't do a good service. Because I believe that maybe the inhabitants of Eastern Europe can do something for the rest of humanity by explaining the experience of watching the Holocaust and other horrors of the 20th century.
Thank you. Please.
How much do Polish school children and university students learn about the Holocaust, and has that changed over time in a way that might explain some of the different responses in this particular instance?
Thank you very much. It's a very good question, actually. Our museum is largely an educational institution, so we are very much interested in what kids learn at school about the Holocaust and Jewish history in general. And well, first, even under the communist regime, while the fact that Holocaust had specific features different than the persecution of other groups by Nazi Germany was largely marginalized, it still was present, maybe not so much in history classes, but the classes of Polish literature, because of Borowski, Naukowska, and others. And in democratic Poland, there has been a obvious dramatic progress. That means school curricula require. I wrote a textbook for secondary schools for the 20th century history, so I know it. The ministerial guidelines for textbooks state that any history textbooks to be approved to public school must have a chapter on the Holocaust. Okay? The question is the quality of this chapter. And then the quality of the teacher and training of the teacher who uses it. So I understand that the most important thing is the training of the teachers for it. And here, I must confess that I had a prejudice. I underestimated the readiness and the willingness of Polish teachers to teach about it. And I understood it 4 years ago when we, for the opening of our core exhibition, we have also produced a film for all those who could not come to Warsaw and see the exhibition. We have produced a film for secondary schools, 2 young actors walking along our exhibition and talking about Polish Jewish history, a 1-hour film, very simple, plus materials for teachers, how to use it in class, you know what to do. And the target, the objective which I set to our education department was to reach to 50,000 kids. Okay, if we can reach out to 50,000 kids, it's going to be a great success. We are just beginning. On a single day, 18,000 classes all around Poland logged in to see the film. Average class size is 25 to 30 kids. That makes more than 400,000 kids on a single day. But what it meant for me that 18,000 teachers all around Poland made the decision to show the film to their classes. And when I had a look on the geographical distribution I expected it to be, Warsaw, Krakow, big cities with educated intelligentsia. No, it was mostly small places, villages and small towns. So there is an interest in it. Second, there are some studies of Polish textbooks about it that were produced, as far as I remember, one for the American Jewish Committee several years ago. So Holocaust is present in all of the textbooks, in all the curricula. The question is the quality of this presentation. There are also some studies about the knowledge. So, for example, Polish students are much more frequently recognize the meaning of the words like Treblinka. But the reason is obvious. Treblinka is in Poland. Okay, so they recognize what is Auschwitz, what is Treblinka, and so on. But because Holocaust is an important chapter of history of Poland. Is it enough? I don't know. I don't know where is enough. I don't know when we can be satisfied with the degree of knowledge and understanding of the Holocaust.
Please.
Valentina Harhun, Magola Gogol State University, Ukraine. I have two questions. The first one is about Jedwabne. How Jedwabne is represented in your museum? As far as I know, maybe I'm mistaken, the museum received a accusation about the lack of information about Jedwabne. I would really appreciate your comment on this. And my second question also about the museum. Is the museum or any museum an appropriate place to reveal or to talk about very controversial issues, very provocative issues as Jedwabne or any other cases? Thank you.
Let me start from the second question. Of course. Of course, museums around the world struggle to show they are relevant. And historical museums struggle to show that history is relevant, that the past is relevant. And this past is obviously relevant. Yes, we do show, of course. We show Jedwabne in the context of the wave of pogroms in the summer of 1941 from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. And we actually put side by side two cases, one which may be of interest to you. We have Jedwabne and the Lviv pogrom. Okay? And from Jedwabne, in addition to the very dry, we always clearly differentiate between the voice from the past and the museum voice. So we have a quotation from a testimony of a survivor, some basic information coming from the museum. So for example, we don't agree with Jan Tomasz Gross about the number of victims of this particular crime. He claims 1,600 people, which is unlikely with the evidence available. But it's a museum, so most important things are visual. And there are two visual things. One are photographs of the Jewish inhabitants of Jedwabne taken before the war. Something similar to the Aishishok collection in the Holocaust Memorial Museum in this town. And second, a few keys found in the mass graves of the victims of Jedwabne, keys to their homes. When they were gathered in the market, they took their keys with them. They didn't know what will happen to them. And this is very personal. So it's a small fragment of our, we cover 1,000 years of Jewish history in Poland. So it's a small fragment. I think it's explicit, it's clear, and it's moving. And we don't impose any moral judgment. We believe our visitors can judge for themselves.
Anybody else? Over there, please.
Hi, Suzanne Brown-Fleming at the Holocaust Museum. What do you think the effect has been on scholarship? And what do you think the effect will be in the next few years?
Well, so far, scholarship takes years. As I said, during the heat of the debate, this most recent book of the Center for Holocaust Research was published on hiding in provincial Poland. Quite grim stories about betrayal, killing, denunciations, and so on, and also survival, of course. So I don't know yet. My feeling is that this debate, one of its features was the separation between the debate and the scholarship. Less scholars called to say something on the topic, less references. The research on the Holocaust in Poland in the past 30 years has undergone a dramatic expansion. It's probably the best research aspect of the Second World War history in Poland, in terms both of theoretical sophistication, knowledge of sources, knowledge of languages. Poland, which was marginal in Holocaust research still in the 1980s, became one of the important centers for Holocaust research. We ran a doctoral seminar at our museum for doctoral students coming from various universities in Poland, and many of them do Holocaust research with new perspectives, new kinds of sources. So I'm not afraid about the future intellectual quality of it. Will the chilling effect affect the scholarship? I don't know yet. Time will tell. I'm afraid that we have some losses. For example, the Institute of National Remembrance in the past was also a source of valuable scholarship. For example, a 2-volume publication on Jedwabne. High quality scholarship and a selection of documents from the period. Very, very solid scholarship. It's not likely that at present this institution is able to produce something similar. Most of the historians who did it don't work in the IPN anymore.
Please, right there. Please wait for the mic.
Thank you. I was wondering, I've read a little bit about the fragile, contested status of the museum in Gdansk and the government's lack of support for it. I was wondering how your museum is prone to withdrawn funding, withdrawn support. Can anything like that happen to your museum?
I was watching very closely what was happening to the Museum of the Second World War. And I don't understand the whole operation. It's been the core exhibition at the Museum of the Second World War, Gdańsk, was really high quality. It was based on very solid historiography and a very most welcome stressing of the civilian's perspective on war. The traditional Polish approach is a highly militarized vision on fighters, armies, generals, partisans, and so on. The Gdańsk Museum has a civilian perspective. I'm not afraid of our museum for several reasons. One, we have a very complex legal structure. Museum is a public-private partnership between three founding partners. The initiators of the idea, the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute, the city of Warsaw, and the last elections in Warsaw were watched closely by all of us, and the Ministry of Culture. So I've been the director for 5 years now, and I haven't had a single case of an attempt to press me, to push me to change the exhibition or do something from any Polish politician. This spring, we have heard some critical voices about our temporary exhibition. And this year we had a beautiful exhibition on 1968 in Poland, about so-called anti-Zionist campaign in 68. And we had critical voices from the Minister of Culture and some deputies of the ruling party. And I'm glad to say that probably they contributed to the unprecedented success of this exhibition. Because we have sold 160,000 tickets, which is 3 times more than to any previous exhibition that we had. And again, it shows how much interest there is. In 1968 is not a nice history about, it's rather grim history about persecution and hate speech and fake news, yes. Communist fake news. And second, I hope that a certain consensus of the Polish political elites about our museum remains. And an example of this consensus, which I often quote, is the personal support for the museum coming from 4 consecutive presidents of Poland. Mr. Kaczyński, who was actually a founder of the museum as the mayor of Warsaw, Lech Kaczyński. Later on, he died in a plane crash in Smolensk. And he is a founder, personally a founder of the museum. Mr. Kwaśniewski, who was instrumental in helping build the museum, and especially bringing business donors to the museum. Mr. Komorowski, who was at the opening of the museum, I remember him speaking there. And Mr. Duda, who accepted my invitation soon after his election. He visited the museum and then, standing in front of the cameras, without me asking him, said, every young Pole should visit this museum. I didn't ask him. So I call it a miraculous support, because as you may know, Polish politics is highly polarized now, is very divisive. And to my knowledge, this is the only topic these gentlemen agree on. Otherwise, they disagree on everything else. So I hope it will continue. No funds were cut. About a quarter of our annual revenue comes from the Ministry of Culture. We have a subsidy from the Ministry of Culture. And the same amount comes from the city of Warsaw. There's an agreement between these two founders that they will give equal amount. So at about 20% of our revenue each year, it's about 9 million zloty, which comes from the Ministry of Culture, and we got it. We didn't get any additional fund for the 1968 exhibition, but okay, I didn't expect necessarily the ministry to pay for it. We've got the money from private donors and the city. So diversification of sources of revenue is useful always. So I would say, relatively optimistic. Although when I say optimistic, it reminds me of a joke, old Warsavian joke about what is the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. Let me quote it. Pessimist says, oh, it's bad, it's horrible, it cannot be worse. And optimist says, it can be worse.
On this optimistic note, let's thank Dariusz very much.